Given what you experienced back in 2009, what lessons that would you have taken from that period to apply to today's international crisis?
Yeah, it's up to the chairman, and that's Boris Johnson, to lead. The others would respond. But I think this summit will go down as a missed opportunity. A missed opportunity when we needed 11 billion vaccines. We've only got offered a plan for 1 billion. We needed $50 billion allocated to the vaccination of the world and only $5 billion. And I think this summit, I'm afraid, will also go down as an unforgivable moral failure when the richest countries are sitting around the table with the power to do something about it. Now that we've discovered the vaccine, we have not set out the comprehensive plan that will deliver vaccination by the middle of next year. Boris Johnson said on Sunday that this would be the greatest feat in medical history. He said it was the great challenge of post-war history. Well, I'm afraid there will be smiles, but there are not solutions. Millions of people will go unvaccinated, and thousands of people, I'm afraid, will die.
To be fair, this is not just Boris Johnson, of course. Mr. Biden, Mr. Macron, Mrs. Merkel, they've all agreed to this. This is, if you want to put it that way, a comprehensive global failure then, isn't it?
Well, Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Trudeau did a letter to the Financial Times only 2 days ago in which they said they wanted the G7 to share the cost, 67% of the cost, which is about 50 billion over 2 years of vaccinating and protecting the world with testing and protective equipment. Now, I'll wait to see the final communique, but it looks as if there is a huge gap between what Boris Johnson promised last Sunday and what is actually being delivered. And I'm afraid it is a gap in funding. And I'm afraid it also comes back to the British cuts in overseas aid, that we're not prepared to put up enough money to deal with problems that the world faces, even when the benefits in extra economic activity, if the world gets back to growth and trade, far outweigh the costs of doing this. And so Boris Johnson really has got to think, are we to leave this problem to the G20, to next year or the year after? Because on the basis of the evidence I see, the whole world will not be vaccinated by the middle of 2022, and we will have a huge problem of a division between the richest countries that are safe and the poorest countries that are not safe. But then the problem will come back to haunt the richest countries because we will have contagion spreading that may hurt even the people who are vaccinated because of mutations and variants.
Is it just a matter of funding, though? We heard the Foreign Secretary saying earlier that this is also a question of the mechanism. So, for example, do you really trust the World Health Organization to be able to dispense that level of vaccination, the 11 billion or whatever number you choose, that you think is ideal?
Well, it's at least 11 billion, and it's not just the WHO who's saying that. Every government that's involved in what's called COVAX accepts that these are the figures. You know, what we did in Britain was the right way to do when we're facing the problems of the world. What you do is you put up the money, you pre-order the vaccines, you then build up the manufacturing capacity, and then you have factories, in this case, in every continent. And unless you have this virtuous circle, which starts with the guarantee of funding, then you will not solve the problem. And I fear that the G7 has not only missed this opportunity, but it will take months before the world gets back to discussing this again in the most coherent way. We need a plan. We don't have yet a plan. We're going to have a shortage of vaccines over the summer, and we're still not going to meet the 11 billion that most people who look at this seriously say is needed. 1 billion is welcome, but faced with the need for 11 billion, really the G7, the richest countries, should have done much more.
In your book, which is called 7 Ways to Change the World, you said that after the pandemic is over, we'll still have 260 million children not in education. That the problems that we're facing can't all just be put down to COVID, can they? Even if the disease makes those problems worse.
Well, the Sustainable Development Goals that Britain signed up to, every country signed up to, say everybody in education by the year 2030. Now, Britain has done a lot in the past. We've offered to fund the education of 40 million with the G7 countries, but that's 40 million girls. But there will be 400 million girls leaving school or not at school over the next few years, leaving school without qualifications. So again, we're dealing with only a fraction of the problem. It's the gap, Trevor, between the promises that the international community makes Boris Johnson made on Sunday and the reality that when it comes to it, yes, there'll all be smiles at the end of the summit, but where's the substance when we need to get the vaccinations in place, we need to get children back to school, we need obviously also to deal with this escalating problem of poverty around the world. There are 150 million more people in poverty since the start of the crisis, and that's 150 million people who don't really have the food that they need to survive.
A quick question about domestic policies, as it were. The Irish Prime Minister told us this morning that he thought a solution to the Northern Ireland Protocol issue was possible. What would you be proposing were you in the Prime Minister's seat today?
This can only be solved by people getting around the table and talking about it. There are difficulties in administration, but the protocol will not change, in my view, over the next few months. You know, when I was Prime Minister, even at the height of the financial crisis, I spent days in Northern Ireland talking to all the parties, listening to their complaints, their queries, answering some of their problems. And this needs time. It needs a Prime Minister who is prepared to spend the time speaking to people in every part of Northern Ireland, as well as speaking to the Government of Ireland and the European Union. And it can't be done simply by a few statements that the protocol may need to be looked at again, or alternatively, that someone else has got to solve the problem for him. He's got to spend the time, and it's only the Prime Minister, I'm afraid, and it does come back to who's in charge. You can't solve this Northern Ireland problem without the Prime Minister engaging it with the fullest attention that will be needed as the G7 summit finishes.
But subtly, without any great fanfare, the truth is that what they say in Northern Ireland, or some people say in Northern Ireland, is that this is all undermining Northern Ireland's place in the Union. Do you not fear that drift to separatism?
Well, I think Boris Johnson, again, has got to understand that this is a union of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And each part of that union has got its own cultural traditions, its own sensitivities, its own needs and its own aspirations. And you've got to work at this. The job of a Prime Minister, and perhaps he's the only person that can do it, he or she, is to unite the whole country, to bring people together. I believe there should be a forum that brings together the nations and the regions in a more systematic way so that common problems are discussed, chaired by the Prime Minister. But you can't assume that the United Kingdom is going to hold together if you don't work at it. And that demands efforts at cooperation, policies for cooperation, instruments for cooperation, and of course a determination that cooperation is going to work.
In your book, if we can return to the global situation, Henry Kissinger talks about a new Cold War between liberal democracies and authoritarian states, by which he means Russia and China. Do you agree with that analysis? And if so, what can we do to avoid it? Or is it inevitable?
I think he's right. I think he's right about the risk. And the risk is even greater than he's describing. It's one world, two systems. It's not just a Cold War. It's people moving in a completely different direction. One international monetary fund for the West, one for Asia, one World Bank for the West, one for Asia, one currency or set of currencies dominating in the West, one in Asia. And I think we've got to avoid that. I have always stood out against the human rights policies of China. We had a human rights dialogue with China, but I've always also said that where we can agree, like on climate change, like on actually a plan to vaccinate the world, like on dealing with some of the huge global problems we face, including economic growth in the poorest countries, we have to find a way to work together. I suspect that's what Joe Biden wants to do. Amidst the fiery rhetoric against China, he believes there are areas where you can cooperate, and you should, but also areas where you've got to say very clearly, we disagree entirely with what you're doing, and we will try to persuade you to change your mind. But you have to concentrate in a world as fragile as this, where we have huge problems that are global. We have to concentrate on finding ways to work together where we can.
Okay, we have a very short time, but I don't think I can let you go without asking you a question about Scotland and Labour. No, it's not an argument that Labour probably is not where it would like to be in polls and elections, looking at the recent local elections, the prospect of losing Batley and so on. But a big issue for the Labour Party is its position in Scotland, which is dire. What should Labour be doing to restore and regain its status in Scotland?
Well, we've got to show that we're both the party of social justice and that the Scottish National Party are not delivering that despite all their promises, and we're the party of solidarity. In this interdependent world, there is no future in nations that are neighbouring nations fighting each other. And I fear 50 years of conflict between Scotland and England if we don't get these problems sorted out. So we have got to be the party of solidarity, of talking about empathy, reciprocity, cooperation and sharing. And of course, we've found during the vaccination effort that when we cooperate, we get things done. British pre-purchasing, Scottish delivery in Scotland of the vaccine. Now that's a way forward on health, but it's a way forward on climate change, which cannot be solved without countries working together, and the recovery, where jobs are going to be needed to be created, and we need all the resources of the United Kingdom in every part of the United Kingdom put to work.